Chapter 24. Roche loved the night shift. It was why he'd volunteered for the job years ago. Every other doctor whined and complained when their rotation put them in the morgue at night. But Roche? Shit, if he had his way, he'd never see the sun again unless it was during vacation. And hell, even then he'd sleep all day until it was time to go out on the town. Working at night had certain advantages. For one thing, he never had to deal with much traffic. For another, his breakfast was always an early dinner at a swanky restaurant. While all the other poor slobs in the city were stuck in traffic, he drank coffee or iced tea and watched them struggle to make their way through the snarled freeways. Dealing with that insanity was more than enough to make any sane person find a way out. Roche had found his escape many years ago. The morgue was always quiet, but at night it was, pardon the pun, deathly so. The day shift left him plenty of work to do, and some very interesting cases to be sure. But at night was the car wrecks, the shootings, the emergency cases that even God couldn't put back together. And the only thing Roche liked better than being awake at night was working on papers about traumatic injuries. Thus far, he'd had 7 published, been invited to speak at 10 different conferences, and held a somewhat infamous distinction of being a phenom when it came to death. Medical examiners from all over the United States asked him to consult on their more difficult cases, and Roche had seen some absolutely strange shit in his time at Ben Taub. One day he'd have to find some new digs, but for now, the basement and the chilly stainless steel morgue was his home, and home was a happy place. When the basement lights went out, he didn't even notice. They'd moved the morgue storage and examination suites to their own circuit to ensure the bodies stayed cold and they didn't have a repeat of what happened after Hurricane Ike. He hadn't been at the hospital then, but he'd heard the stories of the rotting bodies and the mealworm infestation that had taken months to get rid of. For all he knew, the little bastards were still in the sheetrock, living and waiting for the next chance to chomp on some dead flesh. Roche, dressed in a skinny puppy t-shirt beneath his warm smock and apron, stood before the body of a once beautiful woman. Once was the key word. Now she was little more than a crispy critter. A dark crust of blackened flesh covered her face. Her aquiline nose had practically melted, the edges puffed out like a burned marshmallow. Her hairless head, covered in 3rd and 4th degree burns, was a monument to the effects of extreme heat on human skin. Roche didn't have any details about the accident. He only knew she'd been brought into the ER 6 hours ago. DOA. If she'd been alive when they tossed her in the ambulance, he'd be amazed. He imagined the poor bastards that scraped her remains from the fire were too horrified to try and take her pulse, and there was little they could have done anyway. The damage to her body's exterior had only been part of the cause of death. Once Roche opened her up, he found something much worse. Her lungs were black and scorched. The heat had boiled her stomach acid and punctured the lining. Even her blood had turned to steam inside her veins. In short, she'd been cooked inside and out. Not even Christ could come back from this kind of damage. He was in the midst of taking his 3rd round of pictures of the chest cavity when he heard something outside the morgue. Something in the hallway. Roche put the camera on the tool tray and looked at the closed door for Suite 2. The noise came again. It sounded like a scream. He walked to the door, his blood-streaked apron flapping with his steps. He opened the steel door and stared into the dark hallway. Yep, the lights had gone out. Again. Roche sighed. That big bastard Mixon would no doubt be heading this way soon. He smiled. He couldn't wait to show him the woman on the table. The last time he'd tortured the man with a stiff, he thought the maintenance engineer was going to pass out, which would have been hilarious. But the look on the man's face had been enough to put a smile on Roche's face for weeks. This was going to be good. He walked to the phone hanging from the wall, the emergency lights barely providing enough illumination for him to see the keypad. He typed in the super's number and waited. He frowned. The buttons made noise, but there was no ring. No dial tone. He jiggled the fang, but nothing happened. He placed the phone back on its cradle with a sigh. He had 2 options. He could wait for Mixon to arrive, or he could go out and get him. He peered back into the autopsy room. She'd wait. There wasn't much more he could do anyway. The cause of death was stupidly simple. Unless, of course, there was a chemical complement he didn't know about. He found that rather unlikely, but he'd have to check anyway. Regardless, he was going to need a computer for his report. He checked his watch and whistled. It was halfway through his shift. Mixon was probably sleeping. Sighing, he removed the apron and smock, hung them from the hooks inside the morgue room, and then stripped off his gloves. He relished the snap of putting on a new pair, as well as taking them off. It was the little things in life that made him smile. He tossed them in the bin and washed his hands in the steel sink. Another scream wailed from outside the morgue. Roche frowned. That sounded like Mixon. What the hell was going on out there? He ran down the hall to the security door and pressed the emergency bar. The door flew open, and Roche stopped in his tracks. The mounted basement security lights lit the area with a garish glow, but it was more than enough light to show him why Mixon was screaming. And then suddenly Roche was screaming too. In the middle of the basement hall, a massive shadow dragged Mixon's portly body into itself. A moment later, Roche realized it wasn't a shadow at all. Several eye stalks protruded from the creature's head and all swung in his direction as Mixon's body completely disappeared. The creature turned on its multi-jointed legs, the hallway echoing with loud clicks as each talon hit the concrete. A mouth blacker than anything he'd thought possible opened as if in hunger, and the thing scuttled toward him. Roche was still screaming in terror when his brain finally realized it was coming for him. The thrash drumbeat of its clicking claws pounded in his ears. It was a mere 3 meters away when he slammed the metal door shut, the security door banging as the auto lock engaged. Roche screeched when the thing crashed into the door. The steel held, but a blister appeared in its middle, and then another and another. He stepped backward down the hall, his eyes riveted on the steel door's surface. This wasn't happening. Simply wasn't happening. No fucking way was this happening. More blisters appeared in the door, the creature battering it with something sharp and strong. Roche continued walking backward until he hit the back wall. He shrieked again, thinking at first he'd somehow wandered into the thing. When he realized it was just the wall, he swallowed his gorge and peered to the right. The morgue. Have to stay in the morgue. He sidestepped into the autopsy room with the crispy critter, closed the inner steel door, and locked it from the inside. The room's brightness hurt his eyes after the long stint in the gloom, but he didn't care. Light. Light was good. Something crashed in the hallway, and his heart skipped a beat or two. The creature had made its way inside. He was so fucked. Roche stepped away from the heavy door and walked backward until his ass hit something. He let out a little squeal and turned. He'd run into the autopsy table. The charred and crispy corpse was still there. Roche loosed a relieved sigh. Bang! 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 He whirled around. The door to Autopsy Room 2 shivered. 3 scars had appeared in its previously unblemished surface. Roche stepped around the table. Heart pounding in his ears, he flicked his eyes from side to side. There was nowhere to hide and no weapons besides the steel instruments next to the examination table. The roar in his ears from his trip-hammering heart and elevated blood pressure made it hard to think. Roche moved around so he could reach the instruments. Weapons, he reminded himself. Weapons. Yeah, right. He'd just watched the goddamn thing swallow a human being whole. What good were scalpels, bone hammers, and saws going to do against it? More rents appeared in the door. It was coming. It would smash the door off the hinges just like it did with the outer one. He was fucked. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. Wait, he thought, there is somewhere to hide. He cast a glance backward to the stainless steel shelves. He could make like a corpse, use one of the empties and wait the thing out. He could do that. He could. But first he needed a distraction. He needed to confuse it. He didn't know how smart it was, but this was his only option. If it figured out he was in one of the shelves, he'd be trapped. He stared at the corpse on the table, mumbled an apology, and then pushed it. The body hit the floor with a wet, crunchy thud. The fluids that hadn't boiled away in the fire spread in a yellow and red pool. Curls of blackened, crusty flesh shook off the corpse like fried chicken skin. He'd give it something to eat. Anything, just as long as it stayed the fuck away from him. He turned and opened one of the 6 doors in the storage wall. A light appeared inside and showed him the shape of a corpse covered in a sheet. Roche cursed, closed it, and opened another with the same result. The creature banged on the autopsy room door again. More dimples in the metal. The goddamned thing was using itself like a battering ram. He didn't even bother apologizing this time. He rolled out the shelf and flung the sheet off the corpse. He caught the sight of a very pale male face, but didn't take a good look. It didn't matter. That's a corpse, he told himself as he pulled it off the tray. I need to keep from being one. The body thumped to the hard tile floor. Something, a bone no doubt, cracked, but Roche ignored it. The only thing left to do was turn off the lights, jump into the tray, and do his best to hide inside. Unless the goddamned thing could see in the dark, it wouldn't find him. He sprinted across the room and hit the master switch. The bright halogen examination lights went dead in an instant. The room was impossibly dark. He pulled his keys from his pocket and hit the button on the fob. Weak LED light streamed out from the embedded bulb. As quickly as he could, he stepped around the examination table and the corpses on the floor. Behind him, the room's door was coming apart. Metal squealed, and he heard the pop of a bolt from one of the hinges. Frantic, adrenaline roaring in his veins, he rushed to the open tray, jumped into it, and did his best to pull himself into the wall. Without leverage from the outside, the tray was difficult to move. He couldn't get enough purchase. Whimpering and doing his best not to panic, and failing, he dug in with his pared fingernails and pushed backward. The tray moved further into the steel crypt. The room shuddered with the crash of the heavy steel door finally flying off its hinges. Roche stopped moving at once. The LED light died as his finger released the switch. He held his breath. Click, click, click. It was in the room. With the exception of its talons on the tile, it was silent. In some ways, he wished it would growl, snort, snuffle, anything but that oppressive, suffocating silence. A sizzling sound erupted in the room, and he shivered. Click, click, click. A smell between overcooked meat and something rancid filled the air. Roche wrinkled his nose and barely breathed through his mouth. Just small sips of air. If it hurt him, it could get to him. He wasn't safe. Wasn't safe. Wasn't. The sizzling rose to a crescendo and then ceased. Something jingled on the tile floor. Roche didn't even want to know what that was. The clicking of the creature's talons grew louder. He sipped a long breath and held it. The damned thing had to be less than 2 meters from him now. Had it reached the corpse that once occupied this shelf? Or was it? The clicking stopped. Roche closed his eyes and wished he'd been able to do more than get himself 3/4 into the wall. He was done for, and he knew it. Crunch, crunch, sizzle. It had found the corpse. The stench was overpowering. He exhaled as quietly as he could. His next sip of breath nearly ended in a cough. The air was foul. It was worse than the stink of week-old drowning victims. The volume of the sizzling hurt his ears and drowned out the thump of his own heartbeat. Roche wanted to scream, to plead to the unnatural thing for his life, and then the sizzling stopped. Had it heard him breathing? Had it heard his heartbeat? He squeezed his eyes shut against the darkness. What could he do to distract it? There had to be something A new sound filled the room. Something like the breaking of bones mixed with the stretching of hemp rope. It was even creepier than the click, click, click of its talons on the tile or the spit and crackle smack of it eating. He wanted to look, but didn't dare turn his head. The creature was close enough to hear any movement he made. If, that was, it could hear it all. The sound continued, accompanied by more clicks, and the sliding of something across the tile floor. What the fuck was it doing? Roche lay as still as possible, his eyes scrunched shut in the absolute darkness, the hundreds of faces from autopsies flashing through his mind. Bisected bodies, butterfly incisions, blood running through the stainless steel sluices, dead eyes, pale dead lips, red and ruined flesh. Then he felt it. It was looking at him. Roche cracked one eye open but still saw nothing. It was so incredibly dark in the room he couldn't even make out the lip of the morgue wall. That crackling sound again. Regardless of not being able to see it, he knew one of its appendages was right above him, probing the wall, looking for him, searching. And then it touched his shoulder. He squealed and then went rigid as something hard scratched across his collarbone, caressing it like a lover. Then it bore down. Exquisite pain flooded his brain as its incredibly sharp talon sliced through his collarbone, severing muscle, tendon, and bone like a scalpel through tissue paper. Roche screamed. Another talon punctured his other shoulder and ripped backward. It pulled him from the tray while his legs kicked and his arms flailed in useless spasms of terror and pain. A crunching sound filled his ears, and then he stopped hearing or feeling anything as he dissolved in the creature's maw.